He's a devil, girl. Best you turn your pretty little self around and walk right back out that door." The words, thick with whiskey and stale tobacco, curled around Leanne like a noxious fume. She stood frozen just inside the swinging doors of the saloon, a slash of crimson silk in a world of brown dust and sweat-stained denim. The journey had stripped away everything but this dress, the last vestige of a life she was supposed to be leaving for something better. This place, this jagged, raw wound of a settlement called Salvation's End, felt like no salvation at all. It was a furnace, the late summer sun beating down on the plank-board buildings until the very air shimmered with a malevolent heat. Inside the saloon it was worse. The heat was trapped, mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. Dozens of eyes, predatory and curious, raked over her, lingering on the unfamiliar cut of her cheongsam, the smooth black of her hair coiled in an intricate knot, the pale oval of her face. She was a doll, a curiosity, a thing to be stared at and coveted. The man who had spoken, a portly barkeep with a greasy apron stretched tight across his belly, gestured with a thumb toward the far, shadowed corner of the room. There, a man sat alone, his back to the wall, a position of tactical advantage she recognized from the tales her grandfather had told of old wars. He was a silhouette against the grimy window, a long-limbed shape of darkness and stillness. All she could make out was the brim of a stained hat pulled low and the glint of a whiskey glass held in one hand. "That there's Jasper," the barkeep continued, his voice a conspiratorial rasp. "He ain't the welcomin' sort. In fact, he ain't any sort at all. Just trouble looking for a place to happen." Leanne's gaze remained fixed on the figure. She had been promised to a Mr. Abernathy, a merchant of repute, a man who would provide a safe and prosperous new life in exchange for a wife from a good, if impoverished, family back home. But Mr. Abernathy was not at the stagecoach depot. He was not at the mercantile. He was, according to the tight-lipped station master, likely to be found here, in this den of filth and despair. She clutched the small, worn satchel that held all she owned, the fabric a flimsy shield against the hostility of the room. Fear was a cold stone in her belly, but desperation was a fire at her back. She had nowhere else to go. The promise of salvation had been a shimmering mirage, and now, standing in the grit of this town, the illusion shattered into 1,000 pieces of dust. A man pushed his way through the crowd, his approach parting the sea of prospectors and drifters. He was dressed in a waistcoat of garish brocade, his face florid and fleshy, a wet cigarello clamped between his teeth. A scent of cloying cologne and sour sweat preceded him. This was Mr. Abernathy. The realization struck Leanne not with relief, but with a fresh wave of dread. He was not the distinguished silver-haired gentleman from the faded photograph her father had shown her. He was a predator, his small, piggish eyes alight with an avarice that had nothing to do with respectable matrimony. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice unpleasantly slick. "The little China doll arrives. A bit scrawnier than advertised, but the goods are sound." He reached out and pinched her cheek, his fingers rough and cold. Leanne flinched back, a gasp catching in her throat. His smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. "Feisty. I like that. We'll have to tame that out of you." He cast a proprietary glance around the saloon. "Gentlemen, my new bride, fresh off the boat. A genuine oriental flower, soon to be the main attraction at Abernathy's palace." A smattering of crude laughter and whistles echoed his words. Leanne's blood ran cold. Palace? This squalid saloon was his palace? She was not to be a wife. She was to be an exhibit, an attraction, another possession to be displayed and used for his profit. The gilded cage she had fled in her homeland with its rigid rules and suffocating expectations, seemed a paradise compared to this filthy public prison. Her father's assurances, the matchmaker's sweet words, all lies woven to sell her across an ocean. Abernathy's hand clamped onto her upper arm, his grip bruisingly tight. "Come now, dearie, let's get you settled in your new home. There's a little room upstairs right above the card table. You'll have a fine view of the establishment." His words were a death sentence. She could feel the stares of the other men, hot and heavy with speculation. She was property, and her owner had just claimed her. She pulled back, a futile, desperate gesture of defiance. "No." The word was a whisper, fragile but clear. Abernathy's face darkened, the jovial mask slipping to reveal the brute beneath. "No? Little girl, you don't get to say no. You belong to me now." His grip tightened, and Leanne cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain that was swallowed by the saloon's din. But not entirely. In the far corner, the silhouette moved. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the sudden, expectant hush that fell over the room. Jasper rose to his full height, unfolding from the shadows like some great, dark bird of prey. He was taller than she had imagined, broader. As he stepped into the weak lamplight, she saw his face for the first time. It was a road map of a hard life, all sharp angles and sun-scorched leather, a pale scar tracing a line from his temple to the corner of his jaw. His eyes, under the brim of his hat, were the color of a winter storm, cold and unsettlingly clear. He moved without a sound, his worn leather boots making no noise on the grimy floor. He didn't stride or swagger. He simply flowed through the space between the tables until he stood before them. He ignored the gaping onlookers, ignored Abernathy's sputtering indignation. His gaze was fixed solely on Abernathy's hand, still clamped around Leanne's arm. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply raised his own hand, large and calloused, and placed it over Abernathy's knuckles. It was not a violent gesture, but it held an undeniable finality. The pressure must have been immense, because Abernathy paled, his bluster deflating like a pricked balloon. He released Leanne's arm with a choked curse, snatching his hand back as if he'd been burned. "This ain't your concern, Jasper," Abernathy hissed, trying to regain some measure of his authority. Jasper's gaze lifted slowly from the now freed arm to Abernathy's face. Still, he said nothing. The silence was his weapon, more terrifying than any threat. It stretched, taut and humming with menace, until sweat beaded on Abernathy's brow. Finally, Jasper spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together. "Leave." It was a single word, an order, not a request. Abernathy, a man who ruled his small kingdom through fear and bluster, found himself facing a power he could not intimidate. He looked around for support, but his patrons were suddenly fascinated by their drinks or the patterns in the wooden tables. He was alone. With a final, venomous glare, he backed away. Jasper then turned his attention to Leanne. His storm-gray eyes met hers, and for a moment the coldness in them was tempered by something else, something she couldn't name. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, but still a command. She looked from his impassive face to the leering crowd, to the seething form of Abernathy. She had a choice, the devil she knew, or the devil they all feared. Without a second thought, she followed him out of the saloon, the swinging doors closing behind her on the life she had been sold into, and out into the blinding, uncertain light of the street. He led her away from the dusty main thoroughfare, past the last of the ramshackle buildings, and onto a faint trail that wound up into the low, scrub-covered hills overlooking the town. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the buzz of insects in the oppressive heat. Leanne's red dress, a symbol of fortune and joy, felt garishly out of place against the muted palette of the landscape. She struggled to keep pace, her thin slippers ill-suited for the rocky ground. Jasper seemed to notice without looking back. His long strides shortened, his pace slowing just enough for her to keep up without having to run. He led her to a small, isolated cabin tucked into a shallow ravine, sheltered by a handful of stubborn, sun-bleached pines. It was stark and utilitarian, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window. It was a hermit's dwelling, a fortress of solitude. This, she thought with a fresh pang of fear, was where the devil lived. But inside, the cabin was surprisingly clean. The floor was swept, a simple cot was neatly made in one corner, and a small stack of books rested on a crate beside it. There was a stone hearth, cold now in the summer heat, and a rough wooden table with 2 chairs. It was a space of profound loneliness, but it was not a place of squalor. Jasper gestured toward the cot. "You sleep here." He took a worn blanket from a peg on the wall and laid it on the floor near the door. He was giving her the only bed, placing himself between her and the entrance. A guard. A protector. The realization was a small, bewildering spark in the darkness of her fear. For the next few days, a strange, silent rhythm established itself between them. Words were a currency they did not trade in. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet and economical, and disappear into the wilderness. He would return hours later with a rabbit or a few birds, which he would clean and prepare with a practiced efficiency. He would leave them for her, along with a bucket of fresh, cool water drawn from a hidden spring, and then he would retreat outside to mend his tack or clean his weapons, leaving her to the privacy of the cabin. She in turn would take the food he provided and cook it, using the few herbs she found growing near the cabin to add a touch of flavor, a ghost of the life she once knew. She would leave a plate for him on the table, a silent offering of gratitude. They ate separately, he on the porch step, she at the table, the open doorway the only connection between them. In the long, quiet afternoons, she would watch him. She saw the way his hands, which she knew were capable of such crushing force, could be gentle as he stitched a tear in his leather saddlebags. She saw the deep weariness in his posture when he thought no one was looking. He was a man walled off from the world, his reputation his moat, and his silence his rampart. She was inside the walls now, and she was beginning to see that the monster the townspeople described was a fiction they had created to explain a man they could not understand. He was not a devil. He was a man in exile, though whether it was self-imposed or forced upon him, she did not yet know. The fragile peace of their silent cohabitation was shattered a week after her arrival. The sun was a molten coin sinking behind the western mesas, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Leanne was inside, washing the single plate and pot from their evening meal, when the sound of approaching horses and coarse male laughter reached the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat. She looked through the small window and saw them, 2 hulking men dismounting near the tree line. They were the sort of men who thrived in places like Salvation's End, their strength lying in their cruelty and lack of imagination. Jasper, who had been sitting on the porch step sharpening a knife, rose slowly. He did not reach for the gun holstered at his hip. He simply stood, a calm, immovable object in their path. The 2 men swaggered forward, their spurs jingling a discordant rhythm. Leanne recognized them from the saloon, 2 of Abernathy's most loyal dogs. "Well now, Jasper," the bigger one, a man with a thick, greasy beard, drawled, "Mr. Abernathy is feeling mighty displeased. Seems you made off with some of his property." His companion, a thinner man with mean, close-set eyes, licked his lips as his gaze slid past Jasper to the cabin door, where he knew Leanne was hiding. "He sent us to collect her. Says he's willing to forget your rudeness if you hand her over nice and quiet." Jasper remained silent, his body perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask in the fading light. The air grew thick with tension, heavy and electric. Leanne pressed herself against the rough log wall, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. She could feel their malice radiating from them, a tangible, suffocating force. This was Abernathy's answer. He would not be defied. He would send his thugs to break down the door and drag her back to that filthy room above the saloon. The bearded man, whose name she later learned was Boone, took another step forward, emboldened by Jasper's stillness. "Don't be a fool. There's two of us. Just give us the girl. A little thing like that ain't worth dying over." Jasper's voice, when it came, was dangerously soft. "She's not a thing, and you're not taking her." The challenge was laid bare. Boone chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "We'll see about that." He and his partner Carter began to circle, spreading out to flank him. They were confident, two wolves closing in on a lone stag. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They saw a quiet man. They did not see the coiled lethality beneath the calm, the lifetime of violence that had honed his every instinct to a razor's edge. Leanne watched through a crack in the door, her knuckles white where she gripped the wood. This was the test. This was where the man of quiet actions would be forced to show the world the truth of his dangerous reputation. The attack came with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Boone lunged, a large knife appearing in his hand as if by magic, its blade glinting in the last rays of sunlight. He was fast for a big man, but Jasper was faster. He moved not like a brawler, but like a dancer, sidestepping the clumsy slash, his hands shooting out to grip Boone's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the knife clattered to the ground as Boone screamed in agony. Carter, seeing his partner disabled, pulled his own pistol, a clumsy, panicked motion. But the world seemed to slow for Jasper. Before Carter could even level the weapon, Jasper had closed the distance between them. He didn't draw his own gun. He used his body as a weapon, his shoulder crashing into Carter's chest, driving the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward. Jasper's movements were a blur of brutal efficiency, a precise strike to the throat, another to the temple. Carter crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the dirt. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Boone was on his knees, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain. Jasper stood over him, breathing evenly, his expression unchanged. The violence had been swift, economical, and utterly devastating. It was the unleashing of a power he kept savagely contained. Leanne's mind reeled. She had seen bar fights, clumsy scuffles born of drink and bravado. This was different. This was the work of a man who understood violence as an art form. Then Boone, desperate and foolish, made a final, fatal error. With his good hand, he scrabbled for the pistol still tucked in his belt. Jasper's hand moved, a flicker of motion so fast it was almost invisible. The heavy Colt appeared in his grip, the sound of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. He didn't fire. He didn't have to. The metallic click was a death sentence. Boone froze, his eyes wide with terror as he stared down the dark, unblinking eye of the barrel. "Get up," Jasper commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Take him and go. Tell Abernathy if he sends anyone else, I'll send them back in pieces." Trembling, Boone staggered to his feet, hauled the unconscious Carter over his shoulder, and retreated into the twilight, leaving a trail of whimpers and curses in his wake. Jasper stood for a long moment, his back to the cabin, the gun still in his hand. When he finally turned, his face was a portrait of self-loathing. He looked at her through the doorway, his storm-gray eyes filled with an old, familiar pain. He expected fear, revulsion. He expected her to run screaming back to the town, back to anyone but him. His voice was a raw, broken whisper when he finally spoke. "I'm only dangerous," he said, the words heavy with a lifetime of regret, "to those who'd hurt you." He holstered his weapon, the movement stiff, and turned away as if he couldn't bear to see the judgment in her eyes. It was then, as he moved into the faint light spilling from the cabin, that she saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his left arm. Blood. In the chaos, she hadn't seen it. Carter's pistol must have discharged as he fell, or perhaps Boone had managed to land the blow with his knife she hadn't perceived. The wound was high on his bicep, a long, deep gash that was bleeding freely, dripping onto the dusty ground. Jasper seemed to ignore it, his focus entirely on the shame of his own violence. He walked over to the water pump, his movements wooden, and began to work the handle with his good arm, intending to wash the wound himself, to tend to his own pain in the solitude he always sought. But Leanne would not allow it. The fear that had paralyzed her moments before was burned away by a new, fierce emotion. He had been hurt protecting her. He had unleashed the part of himself he clearly hated, all for her sake. She would not let him suffer alone. She stepped out of the cabin, crossing the space between them in a few quick strides. "Let me see," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He flinched as if she had struck him, turning his head away. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing. It is bleeding," she insisted. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently taking his injured arm. His entire body went rigid at her touch, a tremor running through him. He was so much larger than her, a man of terrifying strength, yet in that moment he seemed incredibly vulnerable. She led him to the porch step and made him sit, ignoring his silent resistance. She hurried back inside, her mind racing. There were no medical supplies, no bandages. Her eyes fell upon her small satchel. Without a second thought, she pulled out a fine linen chemise, one of the few delicate things she had left from her old life, and ripped it into clean white strips. When she returned, she knelt before him, dipping a piece of the cloth into the bucket of cool water. He watched her every move, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something akin to wonder. Gently she began to clean the wound. The gash was deep, angry, and red against his sun-darkened skin. He didn't hiss or pull away, though she knew it must have hurt. He simply sat, utterly still, allowing her to care for him. This simple act of tending to his injury felt more intimate than any conversation. Her small hands, which had been trained in the delicate arts of embroidery and calligraphy, were now cleaning the blood from a gunslinger's arm. She was no longer a fragile doll. She was a caregiver. As she wrapped the wound with a clean strip of linen, her fingers brushed against his skin. He drew a sharp breath. For the first time, their bond was not forged in silence and observation, but in touch, in care, in a shared moment of vulnerability that solidified their trust more than 1,000 words ever could. The defeat of his men sent Abernathy into a rage. Humiliated and furious, he went to the town's sheriff, a man named Cobb whose loyalty was bought and paid for. They twisted the story, painting Jasper as a crazed kidnapper and murderer who had attacked 2 innocent men. By morning, a posse of 12 grim-faced men, fueled by Abernathy's whiskey and lies, was forming in the main street. They were coming for blood. Jasper knew they were coming. He had been watching the town from the ridge, a grim sentinel. He returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher, his face set in hard lines. He had a small bundle of food and a canteen of water. "You need to go," he said, his voice flat. He pointed east toward the mountains. There's a trail. It leads over the pass. You can get to the next territory. They won't look for you there." He was sending her away, preparing to face the coming storm alone. He was ready to die to ensure her freedom. A week ago she would have taken the offer, fleeing without a second thought. But the woman who stood before him now was not the same frightened girl who had stumbled out of the saloon. She had looked into the face of violence and had not flinched. She had tended his wounds and felt the tremor of his vulnerability. She would not abandon him. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He stared at her, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Lynn, you don't understand. They are coming to kill me." "Then I stay," she replied, her chin lifting in defiance. "I stay with you." A flicker of some powerful, unnamed emotion crossed his face before he masked it again. Her refusal changed everything. He could not fight a defensive battle at the cabin with her in the line of fire. He had to end this, now, on his own terms. His plan shifted, the pieces clicking into place behind his cold, calculating eyes. He would not wait for them. He would go to them. He checked his pistol, his movements economical and precise. He looked at her one last time. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Then he was gone, walking down the trail toward Salvation's End, a lone figure marching to meet an army. But he was not just a gunslinger anymore. He was a man with something to protect, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. The final confrontation took place in the center of town, the midday sun beating down on the dusty street. Abernathy, Cobb, and their posse were met not by a man hiding in the hills, but by Jasper, standing bold as brass in the open. "Abernathy," Jasper's voice carried, clear and steady, "this is between you and me. Let them go." Abernathy laughed. "You're in no position to make demands, killer." He was about to give the order to fire when Jasper spoke again. "I know about the freight wagon in 78, the one that disappeared outside of Laramie, the one full of Army payroll." A murmur went through the posse. Sheriff Cobb's face went pale. Abernathy's sneer faltered. "That's a lie," he spat. "Is it?" Jasper countered. "Is it a lie that the lone survivor described the leader as a man with a tattoo of a coiled snake on his right forearm? A man who shot his own partners in the back to keep the gold for himself?" Abernathy instinctively glanced at his own arm, a subconscious damning gesture. The men in the posse looked at each other, their certainty wavering. They had signed on to hunt a kidnapper, not to die for a back-shooting thief. Jasper had exposed the rot at the town's core, and in doing so had cleared his own name not through innocence, but by revealing a greater evil. The standoff shattered, not with a hail of bullets, but with the dissolution of a lie. The posse melted away, unwilling to be pawns in Abernathy's game. It was just him and the sheriff left, and Cobb was already backing away. In that moment, Abernathy, stripped of his power, was just a fleshy, sweating coward, and he was standing opposite a man who he had wronged, a man who had every reason to kill him. Just as the fragile peace settled over the dusty street, a new sound intruded, the rhythmic clatter of fine horses and the rumble of a well-sprung carriage. It was an alien sound in Salvation's End, a vehicle of wealth and order in a land of chaos. The carriage, black and gleaming, pulled to a halt at the end of the street. A man stepped out, dressed in a severe dark silk suit that seemed to repel the dust and heat. He was Chinese, but he carried himself with the cold authority of the men who ran the railroads and the banks. Leanne, who had disobeyed Jasper's order and had followed at a distance, felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. She knew him. Mr. Sung. He was the agent for the trading company that had arranged her passage, the architect of her sale. He represented the world she had fled, a world of suffocating duty and polite, soul-crushing cruelty. Mr. Sung's eyes, small and sharp like chips of obsidian, scanned the scene. Abernathy's pathetic retreat, Jasper's imposing figure, and settled on Leanne. His face registered no surprise, only a flicker of annoyance, as if she were a misdelivered parcel. "Leanne," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth, "your family is most displeased. This spectacle is an embarrassment. You will come with me now. The arrangement with Mr. Abernathy is void, but your obligation remains." He spoke as if Jasper wasn't even there, dismissing him as part of the savage landscape. He was the voice of her past, of filial piety twisted into a weapon of control. He was offering her an escape from the immediate danger of the West, but it was a return to the gilded cage, to a life of silent servitude. This was her final test. Jasper had fought the town for her. Now she had to fight her own history. She stepped forward, out from behind the cover of a water trough, and faced the agent. The red silk of her dress was torn and stained, but she wore it like armor. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My obligation is finished. My life is here. Mister." Sung's thin lips tightened. "You would choose this filth over your family? Over honor? You will disgrace us." "There is no honor in selling your daughter," Leanne replied, the words tasting of a freedom she had never known. She walked across the street and came to a stop, not behind Jasper, but beside him. A partner, a peer. Jasper, who had remained a silent, watchful presence, shifted his weight slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood beside her, his presence an unshakable declaration. Mr. Sung looked from Leanne's defiant face to Jasper's stony resolve. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized it now. It wasn't the power of guns or money, but the indomitable power of two people standing together against the world. He was a creature of contracts and ledgers. He had no defense against this. With a final, contemptuous sneer, he turned, climbed back into his carriage, and ordered the driver to leave. The carriage rolled away, taking the last shadow of her old life with it, leaving her standing in the harsh, beautiful, and freeing light of her new one. 5 summers had passed. The sun that beat down on the small cabin was the same, but everything else was different. The cabin was no longer a stark shelter, but a home. A garden bloomed with stubborn life beside the porch, full of the herbs Leanne had carefully cultivated and vegetables that seemed to defy the arid soil. A sturdy lean-to had been added to the side, housing a gentle mare and a handful of chickens that scratched in the dust. The town of Salvation's End still festered down in the valley, but it was a world away. After Abernathy's exposure and hasty departure, the town had largely left them alone. Their isolation, once a necessity, had become a choice, a cherished sanctuary. Leanne sat on the porch step, mending one of Jasper's shirts, her fingers moving with a familiar, comforting rhythm. Her hair was no longer in a severe knot, but in a simple braid that hung down her back. The red cheongsam was packed away in a wooden chest, a relic of a former life. She now wore simple, practical dresses of calico and cotton. Jasper was at the edge of their small plot of land, splitting firewood for the coming winter. He moved with the same quiet efficiency, the same contained power, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. The haunted, self-loathing look that had shadowed his features had receded, replaced by a deep, settled calm. He finished his work and walked toward the cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He stopped beside her, and his gaze fell on a small, vibrant wildflower that had pushed its way up between the porch floorboards. He knelt, his large fingers surprisingly delicate as he plucked it from its tenacious hold. He didn't speak. He simply held it out to her. Leanne looked up from her sewing and smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that made the corners of his own mouth lift in a rare, soft smile of his own. She took the flower and tucked it into her braid. Their life was woven from such moments, a tapestry of silent understanding and small, profound gestures. They had few words because they had no need for them. He knew, from the way she seasoned their stew, that she was content. She knew, from the way he watched the sunset, that he was at peace. He sat down on the step beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. They sat together in the fading light, watching the sky bleed into shades of rose and gold over the mesas. They had faced down brutes and bullies, defied a corrupt town and a cruel past. They had forged a bond in silence and sealed it in violence and vulnerability. Here in their hard-won sanctuary, the gunslinger who believed himself unworthy of love and the girl who was sold as a fragile doll had found more than just salvation. They had found home.